Hey guys, this is Kerry, and in this video we're going to be looking at assigning values to variables. So we're going to open up our terminal and start programming in Python. So to get started, currently we're programming in Unix, so we need to switch to Python, so we type Python 3. Now we're in our Python interpreter, and we're ready to go. So in the last video we looked at doing calculations like 2 plus 5. That gave us 7. But say we wanted to use this 7 in a later calculation, we'd have to either copy and paste it, or we'd have to type it in. Now with 7, that's not too bad, but with other variables, it might be a lot, or with other values, it might be a lot worse. So say we did 666 to the 10th power, like we did in our lesson. You wouldn't want to have to retype this, and you wouldn't want to have to constantly be copying and pasting. So the way that we can more easily do this is we can create an easier way to refer to this number. So maybe we would do something like x equals, and then we'll copy and paste this number. So now whenever I type x, that whole number is going to appear on the screen. So if I did something like x squared, it's going to take x and square it. So this should look pretty familiar from your math classes, but the way that this is often read in programming is x gets this number. So even though it's more illustrative of why you'd want to use it with larger numbers, I'm going to be sticking to smaller numbers because it's easier to say and easier to think about. So let's do another example. All right, so here we go. X gets 2. So let's see. Let's do x times 7. So what's going to happen is when you see the x here, it's going to look up, well, what is x? Oh, well, x is 2, so it's going to say 2 times 7, and that's 14. You can define multiple variables, so you could do y equals 3, and now you can do x times y, and it's going to say, well, what is x? And it's going to look through all the previous lines of codes. Well, x is 2. What's y? Y is 3, so 2 times 3 is 6. This, of course, raises the question, what happens if you try to do a calculation with a letter you haven't used or a variable you haven't used? So let's do 4 times a. So Python's going to say, well, I know what 4 is, I know what times is, where's a? And it's going to go through line by line, and it's going to say, well, I don't have an a, so let's see what happens. It has a traceback error, and it says a really nice error message here. It says, name error. The name a is not defined. That's one of the best parts about Python as a programming language, is that the errors are actually super easy to understand. So the name a is not defined, and that makes sense. We never defined this. So now if we said a equals 5, and we try the same calculation, 4 times a, that gives us 20. So one last interesting thing to look at with these simple variable calculations is you can actually say, well, x times y, that was 2 times 3, that's 6. But you can actually say, well, what if we want to take the answer to x times y and store it in a new variable called z? So we'll say z gets x times y. And the way that the assignment operator works is it will do this calculation first. It'll do everything over here before assigning it. We'll say 2 times 3 is 6, so z gets 6. Now when we type z, it's 6. And we can use z in a later calculation the same way that we used all the other ones. So x plus y plus z, that's going to be 2 plus 3 plus 6, that's 11. All right. So this is, I think, everything for single letter variable names, but you might be wondering, do you have to use single letters for your variables the same way that you did often in math? And the answer is no, and the answer is actually you should not be using single letter names for your variables. It's going to make life a lot easier if you use variable names that actually are descriptive. So say you're doing a physics problem. Instead of using x for your variable, it might make sense to say, well, your speed equals 10. Then you might want to say something like your time equals 5. And if you took physics, you'll know that distance is going to equal your speed times your time, as long as the units match up. And this actually is so readable in English that you wouldn't even think you're using Python code to do it. But what's happening is it's saying, well, what was speed? And it will look up, where's speed? Oh, here it is. Speed is 10. What's time? And it will look up, well, where's time? Time is 5. So distance is going to be 10 times 5. Let's see what the distance was. 10 times 5, 50. Yep, that works. Similarly, if you did something like force here, it's going to have a problem because you haven't defined force. So these are your variable names, and I encourage you not to use single letter variable names, but to actually use descriptive ones, because when you're writing more complex code, having full words like this will definitely help you. So let's talk about some of the limitations of variable names. So what we've seen so far is that we can let single letters equal be variable names. We can let more complex things like words be variable names. You can actually say, well, say you're doing a distance problem in physics and you had like time 1 equals 5 and time 2 equals 8. It's okay to end your variables with numbers. So if you type time 1 here, you get that. And similarly with time 2, you get what you expect. If you do something with like numbers in the middle, I don't know, equals 13, let's see, T1IM3E, Python has no problem retrieving that variable. One limitation with numbers, though, that you might not expect is you actually can't start your variable name with a number. So if you try to do 1 time equals 70, it's going to say invalid syntax. And that makes sense because you can't start your variable name with a number. So you have to time 1, etc. Okay, let's see. One last thing to talk about is maybe you want to put a space in your variable name. So something like, I don't know, first time equals 13. Notice I didn't actually put a space. I put an underscore. And the reason why I put an underscore is if I try to use a space, it's not going to be able to interpret that because it's going to read first and time as two separate variable names. So let's see what happens. It says invalid syntax. So people will often use an underscore character when they want to include a space in their variable name because it looks similar to a space. But because a character is there, it actually interprets this whole thing as the variable name. Now if you want to access that, you type first time and you get 13. So in simple programs like this, it sort of undermines the importance of variable names. Later when we have a whole script running, we're not going to want to worry about the details. We're going to say whatever the result is, just use that. And that's what variable names allow us to do. They allow us to reference values that we've previously gotten and use those conveniently.